When Loving Your Neighbor Backfires and Breaks. February 7th, 2022. This is not a post about COVID. It's about sex. So, at one point during the last few years, the pulpits of the church, the term love your neighbor was applied to masks. Now, the masks in question are simple enough to understand when you're loving your neighbor, but the loving your neighbor bit might be a bit more complicated. Because at one point, any mask was both allowed and, in fact, loving your neighbor by wearing it. A cartridge-filtered, full-face respirator was loving your neighbor, and a bandana was also loving your neighbor. The cartoon bedsheet recycled handmade unit your grandma made for you was loving your neighbor, and the message was clear and the practice was near orthodox. Put something on your face. Love your neighbor. Simples. But then, the creeping admittance of the quality of mask began. Truly, it's been there all along. We all knew masks were on a spectrum of good and better, and now the better is getting to put into the spotlight. We get to see what kind of good loving your neighbor is. The very second we switch from any mask counts to any mask better than this counts, you stop loving your neighbor and you start protecting yourself. We are about to switch from an act of preservation to an act of self-preservation. You can make the argument and demonstrate the usefulness of almost any mask stopping your sneeze from reaching your neighbor, but an N95 stops their sneeze from getting to you. The half-face respirator does the same, and the hazmat suit, which is at the end of this spectrum, treats the person on the inside and the person on the outside very differently. This switch erects a fence between neighbors we loved, makes us and a them, instead of insisting that we're all in this together with good intentions. We become all in this at the same time with some very distinct barriers between us. But then again, what makes better neighbors than good fences? Can you love your neighbor by protecting yourself first? Is it not love when you forego the protection that they may not have? Is love being equally unprepared, like a bandana in close contact? We could use a greater personal protection, but at the cost of protecting ourselves and no longer our neighbor. The problem the church faces is that we applied a theology of grace to an object of wrath. We said something was beautiful when in fact it was disposable and contaminated, and that contamination was never dealt with. It found its way into every part of our lives under the auspice of love, when in fact it was nothing more than darkness. We believed in a thing called love. Love is patient and love is kind. Love does not envy and it does not boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoings, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. 1 Corinthians 13, 4-8, English Standard Version. We were not patient when we took the masks that didn't protect us from a virus as if they did, so we could do the things that we had done before. We were not kind. We were not kind by excluding people who would never wear those insufficient masks. We boasted at their effectiveness, in spite of evidence to the contrary. We arrogantly compared them to clothes as if masks were only a matter of pants in public. We rudely insisted that it was this way or nothing in our churches. Well, not nothing. You could always visit online. But don't get me started on irritability and masks. Best leave the resentment out too. Did we rejoice in wrongdoing? Well, we called a thing that doesn't work a thing that did. It's a gray and troubled water that rejoicing in would be questionable, to say the least. We most certainly did not rejoice in the truth. We believed in a lot of things, and we bore a lot of things, and we hoped for and endured a lot of things, all while wearing these masks, asking ourselves if it would ever end. And at one point, we decided that loving your neighbor was what we were going to do, and we would have done it if not for our approach. We tried to love with a broken idea of love, of saying one thing and meaning another. Ignorance is only bliss until truth shows up. And truth is about to show up in every box of N95s that will actually stop the bug from infecting people who wear them. Just not the way we've lovingly said masks would from the get-go. Why is this a problem? Because the dichotomy of actual versus real protection and barriers in the practice of Christian faith. Because if loving your neighbor was possible with a barrier that doesn't stop the virus from being transmitted, then how on God's green earth are you going to argue that a condom doesn't make sex not sex by an actual barrier between the offending sexual body parts? Especially if non-Christians, and Christians for that matter, say that sex with a condom isn't real sex. In the same way that we said loving your neighbor with a mask that didn't work was love. You can't conflate those two things, Mikey, they'll say. No, really. If only there were scriptures that talked about actually touching things. And they shall make an ark of acacia wood. 2 cubits and a half shall be its length, and 1 cubit and its half shall be its breadth, and 1 cubit and a half its height. And you shall overlay it with pure gold, inside and outside. You shall overlay it, and you shall make it on molding of gold around it. You shall cast 4 rings of gold for it, and put them on the 4 feet, and 2 rings on the one side of it, and 2 rings on the other side of it. And you shall make poles of acacia wood, and overlay them with gold, and you shall put the poles into the rings on the side of the ark to carry the ark by them. The poles shall remain in the rings of the ark, they shall not be taken from it. And Exodus 25:10-15, ESV. And when they came to the threshing floor of Nakon, Uzzah put his hand on the ark of God and took hold of it, for the oxen stumbled. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah, and God struck him down because of his error, and he died there because of the ark of God. Samuel 6:6-7, English Standard Version. Tell me, does your understanding of biblical instruction and definition of extramarital and premarital sexual sin talk about contact of genitals or orgasms? Because I can guarantee if you said wearing a mask was loving your neighbor, you think it's orgasms, and you can't defend it from an understanding of the Bible. The very same way David lost Uzzah's life by putting the Ark of the Covenant on a cart instead of using the poles that were meant for it, and the same reason why you thought intentions of safety through an ineffectual mask would have paved a road to hell. When does sex become sex? Because we're told in youth group that asking for a line was the problem in and of itself, that knowing how far was too far was the wrong heart to have something as serious as sex. But now, in the age of infections and breakthrough cases and contact tracing and jabs, we find ourselves ironically preoccupied with how close people got and whether or not bodily fluids were transmitted. This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me, and in vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. Matthew 15:8-9, English Standard Version. The masks were never about safety. They were about principles, and you didn't have any. You had emotions. Emotions won't save your neighbor, but they will make you feel good like all orgasms tend to do. The truth of the matter is that it wasn't the false notions of sex with protection that made you sinful, it was the lust. And your anger at the unvaccinated made you their murderers. Heaven knows the virus wasn't statistically likely to do it for you. And now you're faced with the slowly encroaching problem of real barriers to the compromises you made to use them. The looming threat of N95's protection on the shelves beside cherry-flavored permission to sin. How on earth are we going to navigate a world where other people can make you sick because of their lack of PPE? How are Christians going to maintain their witness and love their neighbor when they can asymptomatically give them a disease? How do we run a kids program without knowing if everyone's vaccinated? Look at all this due diligence stacking up like mint and cumin. Especially, and eventually, someone is going to take it personally and get sick personally. And is it really the worst thing in the world to be sued by a Christian for giving another one your cough? But brother goes to law against brother, and that before unbelievers. To have lawsuits with one another is already a defeat for you. Why not rather suffer wrong? Why not rather be defrauded? But you yourselves wrong and defraud, even your own brothers. 1 Corinthians 6:6-8, English Standard Version. Or maybe, just maybe, the answer isn't finding a way to sin, but finding payments for it. We sing songs about being desperate for the grace of Christ, at least we did in the 90s, and we're lost right now, like one sheep out of 99, and the only person who is going to save us is Jesus. He's not going to do it through an AHS update or a vaccine or a mask. He's going to do it with a cross. Everything else we do is filthy rags. You meet him who joyfully works righteousness. Those who remember you in your ways, behold, you were angry and we sinned, and in our sins we have been a long time, and shall we be saved? We have all become like one who is unclean, and all of our righteous deeds are like a polluted garment. We all fade like the leaf, and our iniquities like the wind take us away. There is no one who calls upon your name, who rouses himself to take hold of you, for you have hidden your face for us. You have made us melt in our iniquities. Isaiah 64, 5-7, English Standard Version.